You're listening to the Greeks Gridiron. Now here's your host, Ethan Haristadoulou.
Welcome back, everybody, to the Greeks Gridiron and to another episode of NFL Predictions, where we dive in game by game, making selections on who I think is going to win each of the 16 matchups we have this weekend here. As a reminder, we are not a betting channel here. I am here to talk football, break down some games, and pick some winners. Do what you will with the information I provide. I finished last week 9-7, and I have come to the conclusion now that I suck at picking week number 1. That has just been the story of my life since I've started doing this. So we're hoping for better than 9-7. Obviously, my goal is always double-digit correct predictions. So 10 or more is always the goal. And we'll start at the very first game of the weekend. Today's matchup, we have ourselves the Buffalo Bills heading into Miami to take on the Dolphins. Both teams are 1-0, battling it out for the division lead in the AFC East. The first thing that comes to mind when I'm looking at this matchup here, the weather. Yes, it's an 8:15 game, but it is an 8:15 game in Miami, and that means it is going to be, based off what the weather's looking like, around 87 degrees at kickoff. So nice, hot, and humid, but thankfully no sun. And I do think that does benefit Buffalo in a little bit of a way here, because if you guys don't know, the way Miami's stadium is built on purpose, mind you, it is built so that the sun is beaming on the opponent's sideline the entire matchup, sucking the soul out of their opponents for the duration of the 3 hours or so you're there typically for a football game. So I do think that is a positive for Buffalo. It's still going to be hot, nasty, and humid, but you at least don't have that glaring sun on you. Now, as for the actual matchup itself in the football stuff I'm looking at here, as far as the Bills offense goes, a couple of things I'm watching in this matchup here. Firstly is going to be tight end Dalton Kincaid. Did not get a lot from him last week. 1 reception, 11 yards. I'm expecting them to try to attack over the middle a little bit more with him. He ended up exploding late last season for the Bills, so I was a little surprised to see him get a little bit less of attention than I would have expected, considering the changes to the offense and the way things have restructured here. I'm looking to see him get a little bit more action this week. And then running back James Cook, who totaled up over 100 yards last week total. This is a guy that I really think is going to be good for close to that number week in and week out this season. He really came into his own last season with the offense, and I'm really excited to see how he continues to do so, because if he can bring true balance to this offense, and although Josh Allen did kind of have to strap on the cape last week and win that game, if you can have someone like James Cook out of the backfield racking up near 100 yards per game between rushing and receiving, it just makes that job of Josh Allen's, which at this point, I've hammered for a long time. They need to stop making him wear the cape, but it just kind of seems to be, it is what it is. And at this point, if you can just make his job as Superman a little less difficult, that is not a bad thing in my opinion. You also have a good matchup here that I'm really looking forward to, and that's going to be the defensive ends of Buffalo taking on the offensive tackles over there in Miami, as you have Greg Rousseau, who exploded with 3 sacks last week, and of course, playing alongside Von Miller. That is the key here. If you look at Greg Rousseau's production when Von Miller is on and off the field, it is night and day. I don't know what it is about those two running together that causes Greg Rousseau to explode, but he is coming into his own as a premier pass rusher for the Bills, while Von Miller is the savvy vet, the guy that teams do have to respect because of his track record, not only in regular season, but in postseason as well, and just what he's able to do. I'm looking forward to seeing how Teron Armstead and Austin Jackson handle those two guys throughout this game here. Another thing I'll be looking at is the Dolphins linebacking room, because obviously you're facing Josh Allen. He has the threat to run the football. Who is going to be responsible for keeping an eye on Josh Allen? The Miami Dolphins, of course, this offseason working the inside linebacking room a little bit, or I guess the linebacking room, because they're not a 3-4, they're a 4-3, but the linebacking room as a whole, getting a little bit more athletic, getting guys that are pure tacklers, and also being able to take care of things like this. I'll be very interested in seeing who has to step up to the plate to keep an eye on Josh Allen, because he did torch the Cardinals on the ground for a couple of rushing touchdowns last season. And then, of course, Tua in week number 1, leading the league in passing yards. The Bills were able to hold Kyler Murray to just 162 yards through the air. The difference, though, in my opinion, between Arizona and Miami is that Miami has that extreme upside, 80-yard touchdown explosion ability at a moment's notice, a big reason why they came out victorious in their matchup last week against the Jaguars. I'll be curious to see how Buffalo handles Tua, who obviously is going to sit in the pocket more, whereas Kyler Murray, at a moment's notice, was bailing out of the pocket and ripping you for big plays here. But we all know what Tua's about, the way he can handle the football, take care of the football, throw the football, place the football in places where his wide receivers are able to take that football to the house at a moment's notice. So a lot of fun matchups in this one here. Some notable injuries just to keep in mind as well here. For the Bills, cornerback Teron Johnson is out for this one. Dwayne Smoot is out as well, the defensive end. You also have a doubtful Javon Solomon as well. So there are some notable injuries there. Raheem Mostert's not playing in this matchup here, and it sounds like Devon Achane's a game-time decision, with Jalen Ramsey being questionable as well. So there are some decent injuries on both sides of this matchup here. So just some stuff to consider whenever you're, if you're placing bets or if you're doing pick'em leagues or whatever it may be, survivor leagues, whatever it may be, just stuff to consider. As for the actual matchup itself, though, I will say that I'm a little bit torn on this one here because Buffalo wasn't perfect last week, but they really came on strong in the second half and kind of did what Buffalo is known for doing and winning in spots where they shouldn't be, they shouldn't be losing, but they may manage to battle back and win. It just kind of seems to be the MO of Buffalo sometimes. Whereas Miami, tighter contest, the offense wasn't quite as explosive as I feel we are typically used to. Obviously, high yardage numbers through the air for Tua, but they were not too great on the ground. I'll be curious to see if that changes a little bit this week, but with obviously the absence of Raheem Mostert and whether Devon Achane even plays or not, it might be another pass-heavy week for the Miami Dolphins. I think, though, I am leading Buffalo just a bit. And while history doesn't necessarily matter too much in the grand scheme of the 2024 season, Buffalo has just seemingly had Miami's number. And on top of that, there were some things in regards to just Miami and their struggles that they dealt with last season that I feel like you might not be able to get away with Buffalo. I could be wrong on that, but there's just like a kind of a gut feeling that I have right now that Buffalo might still have this division, despite a lot of people looking at Miami as maybe the more heavy favorite coming into the season. So I will take Buffalo here. I have them winning 27-24, but this is one of those that I'm not super confident on, but I do like Buffalo a little bit more here. Next, we're going to take a look at the New Orleans Saints taking on the Dallas Cowboys. This one going to be in Dallas, indoors matchup. The first thing I circled as soon as I sat down to look at this game here is going to be right tackle Trevor Penning and how he deals with Micah Parsons and or DeMarcus Lawrence if they happen to swap sides depending on the situation. But Trevor Penning has his hands busy with some elite pass rushing opponents this week, and he's someone who a lot of people were looking at coming into this season as the guy who's now going to have to replace Ryan Ramczyk. How is he going to fare? And I think this is going to be a massive test for him. On top of that, there are a lot of other really interesting matchups within this game as well. One thing I'm really looking at on the Saints defense is going to be how nickelback Alontae Taylor handles CeeDee Lamb. He had a great game against Carolina, 6 tackles, 3 of them for a loss. He had 3 sacks, like a nickel corner, 3 sacks, really. A pass defense, really good game. But now with CeeDee Lamb lining up about 66% of the time in the slot last week, he had 5 catches, 61 yards off 10 targets. He's going to be busy, I'm sure, dropping back into coverage and working alongside CeeDee Lamb for a bulk majority of the game. So I'm very curious to see who wins that contest there. You also have Derek Carr, who's coming into this game off of a wild week 1 for him. Obviously going up against a Carolina Panthers team that's not in the best place right now, but missing only 4 passes last week. Dallas was an issue for Deshaun Watson with the way they played, whether it was going after the quarterback and bringing Deshaun Watson down. They also picked him off a couple of times as well. So the game that we got from Derek Carr last week, the 200 yards, no picks, 3 touchdowns, we're really going to see that challenge this week, in my opinion, with Dallas. And also just, you have guys like Trayvon Diggs that are back in the secondary now. I'm really curious to see, and I hate to put it like this, but what is the reality of this Saints offense? Because I don't think we quite got it last week against Carolina. I think last week's matchup was more indicative of what Carolina is this season than anything else. Obviously, I could be wrong, but it feels like that's kind of how I'm looking at that. Another thing I'm interested in is the Cowboys running back room overall. Saints held the Carolina Panthers to just 58 yards rushing last week. Again, situation, if you put it into perspective of how, what the Carolina Panthers are right now, could be more of the reason as to why, but I don't want to take away credit from the Saints too much. You only got 70 yards from the running back room last week, though, so that is something to keep an eye on here, because if there are some issues with the running game and just not getting enough push up front, or your running backs just not being able to find those holes or hit them hard enough, there is a possibility that the Saints could clamp down on them. They do have one of the more impressive linebacker rooms in the NFL, in my opinion. Like, I look at them and the Chiefs as two of the best in the league as far as the linebacking room is concerned. So interested to see how New Orleans' run defense is going up against, I would say, a little bit more of a talented Dallas offense. And then Cowboys on third down. This is something that, despite how dominant they were in the game, they definitely struggled going 4 of 14, settling for a lot of field goals. And when you look at New Orleans allowing just one third down conversion against Carolina here, if they are going to be one of those top-end third down defenses where they could put the clamps down in the clutch moments, that could pose an issue for Dallas, because I don't think that you're going to be able to get away with as much against this New Orleans Saints defense, especially because they are riding a wave of momentum off that last matchup there. So you don't want to settle for field goals. You want to be able to finish those drives and get into the end zone. Dallas needs to make sure they're converting on those third downs. A couple of injuries that I do think are worth mentioning before we do final score on this one. Saints guard Lucas Patrick, cornerback Marshawn Lattimore, and wide receiver A.T. Perry, among a handful of other guys. That injury list is pretty long for the Saints. A lot of questionables there. Something definitely to keep an eye on here. Whereas the Cowboys, it's really just tight end Jake Ferguson, and he's only questionable, so he might even still be able to play depending on how he's feeling come Sunday. I do really think, though, that with the way this is setting up, injuries do have me a little bit concerned, and I'm really hoping that win against the Carolina Panthers doesn't go too far into the head of New Orleans. I think the Cowboys might come out with the win here, especially being in Dallas. I feel a little bit more comfortable about the Cowboys than I do New Orleans, so I am going to take them 27-21 here. I think the Saints definitely hang around, but there feels like there's somewhat of a reality check kind of coming in for New Orleans here, just with how good that first game went against Carolina. You're now facing a team that's more than likely going to be in the thick of the playoff race come that time of year, and the Cowboys looked really good coming out of the gate, just like overall as a team. Like, yeah, you could reference Dak Prescott's passing yards and things like that, but overall as a team, from offense to defense to even special teams with the punt return touchdown from Kevontae Turpin, the boys feel like they are a very well-rounded team at this very moment right now. The Saints do as well, but when you look at opponents from the previous week, I'll take what Dallas did over the Browns a little more seriously than what New Orleans did over the Panthers. Next, we're taking a look at the Tampa Bay Buccaneers heading into Detroit. This is one of those matchups that I think could be really fun to watch, because the Buccaneers came out last week, and albeit against a Commanders team working with a new head coach, rookie quarterback, a lot of changes going on all over the place, both offensively and defensively personnel-wise, they came in and they looked really, really good. Baker Mayfield finished week one leading the league in touchdowns with 4 altogether. He is also 4th in passing yards right now, so he had himself a game against the Commanders defense that is a bit leaky, in my opinion. Lions are going to need guys like Aiden Hutchinson to step up, be disruptive. He had 7 pressures and a sack last week, so I'm sure he won't have an issue there. And then guys in the secondary like Brian Branch, the safety, who lines up literally all over the football field for them. 3 passes defense last week, making some big plays in that game against the Rams as well. The Lions, though, something to keep an eye on, because this is something that we discussed a lot about coming into this regular season here, is that, just how much better is this defense going to be against the pass. And this past week, albeit it did take like 34 completions for Matthew Stafford to get there, they did allow a little bit over 300 yards against Matthew Stafford. And if Baker Mayfield is feeling himself the way he did last week against this secondary, I definitely could see the possibility of Mayfield having somewhat of a similar game here. So the Lions have got to clamp down on things through the air. Buccaneers defense definitely going to have their hands full, though, on the ground here. The Lions obviously dominating on the ground, running the football. 5.3 yards per attempt off of 163 rushing yards altogether. We saw what happened at the end of that game in overtime. The opposing defense aghast. You line up David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, and you're just smashing the football down their throat late in the football game. It led to a touchdown and a big overtime victory here. Tampa Bay handled Washington's running backs pretty well. Only 50 out of the 138 yards they allowed actually came from running back. So good matchup there, really interesting one. And then another thing I'm keeping in just a little bit of an eye on here, because very curious to see how this shakes out. Buccaneers had a really big issue when it came to running the football last year, the league's worst rushing offense altogether. But Bucky Irving, their running back, 9 carries for 62 yards against Washington. Lions allowed only 83. They looked really good against the run this last week. But Tampa, in my opinion, is that team that they need to establish a stronger running game. And now that you have someone like Bucky Irving, who's flashing a little bit here, again, 9 carries for 62 yards. That's a really good yards per carry average as well. If they can get a solid rushing attack going here and they're able to challenge the Detroit Lions, this one being in Detroit, Tampa Bay has a really good shot at winning this football game. Like, this is going to be one of those closer games, in my opinion here. There are some injuries on the defense of Tampa Bay that have me a little bit concerned. Kalijah Cansey, Zion McCollum, and Antoine Winfield Jr. are all listed as questionable. But this is one of those games that I do think we wind up seeing a lot of points. It's a fight to the finish type of deal. However, though, being in Detroit, I am leaning Lions on this one here, and I'm going to take them 30-29. I feel like right now, if they were to, like, this is one of those, like, home team kind of wins matchups, in my opinion. Like, if this is in Tampa Bay, I'm probably picking the Buccaneers. But I feel like slight hair edge to the Detroit Lions, who had a really fun matchup with them in the playoffs last year as well. So I like this one. I'm excited for it, but I do think I'm leaning Lions just because of the home field advantage in the biggest part. Next, we look at, and this is going to be an interesting one because I'm very curious to see how the Green Bay Packers look here, but they are hosting the Indianapolis Colts here. Now, the Packers, obviously, they're going to be without Jordan Love. It feels like Matt LaFleur is trying to act like in some way that there is a possibility that we see Jordan Love in this matchup. I do not buy that for 1 second. He is not going to be playing for at least, I would say, 4 weeks. I know that the timetable is like 3 to 6. It's probably going to be 4 weeks because you want to be careful. So we're probably not seeing Love take a snap for another month or so. But this is a matchup that is very interesting here because you have 2 offenses, albeit when Jordan Love was still in, very successful in their games this past week. However, there are some flaws, and I'm really looking at Indianapolis on this one here, and I'm about to ream into the team that I like to watch, but I do have some issues with Indianapolis. Juju Brents got thrown on the IR. He's done for the season. That is really unfortunate. You also have defensive ends Kwity Paye and defensive tackle DeForest Buckner, both listed as questionable here, and the defensive line is a strength over there in Indianapolis. Now, with that in mind, you now have Dallas Flowers who's stepping in to take Juju Brent's place for the cornerback spot on that side of the defense. And then on top of that, the offense was explosive. Don't get me wrong, fun to watch, but the way it worked itself out, I don't really know how you can consider it an effective offense. You had 9 completions altogether by Anthony Richardson, albeit for 212 yards. It was awesome. Couple of big touchdowns, only an interception. He had a rushing touchdown as well. But there is not enough consistency in the passing game for me to really look at Indianapolis and feel confident in what they're doing. You couple that with the fact that Indianapolis did not necessarily run the football in some super effective way. You only got like 40-something yards with Jonathan Taylor out of the backfield. It wasn't exactly the most dominating display offensively. Like, the scoreboard almost lies to you a little bit because it took 2 massive bombs of plays that took up a large portion of the entire total offense that Indianapolis put up in that match. Like, that 65-yard touchdown to Alec Pierce was in large part, when you look at the total yardage numbers, nearly almost a third of what the offense was for that day. So just some stuff that I have in mind. I'll be looking at Isaiah McKinney and Javon Bullard, the safety of the Green Bay Packers, in the backfield to try and prevent those massive plays that absolutely killed Houston's secondary there. But also I'm looking at Josh Jacobs on the Packers side of things. Packers really need him to step up and alleviate the pressure from Malik Willis. Indianapolis finished week 1 allowing 213 yards to the Houston Texans on the ground. That is by far the league's most. So if Josh Jacobs can settle in, be that aggressor out of the backfield, help out Malik Willis, who, We'll see what he looks like. We didn't really get a ton, but it did not look promising in the limited action we saw from him in Green Bay last week. I'm very curious to see what happens over there with this Green Bay team, because I looked at them as a playoff team, but right now I have them right on the fringe, and if they can stay afloat and steal a few games, there's a good possibility that they wind up being okay, but I'm a little bit nervous about what this quarterback situation is going to look like in Green Bay. They have to protect the football. They cannot take big risks, because Indianapolis, although they had no takeaways this past week, they had one that was like this close because Juju Brents was like a heel out of bounds. So you cannot put the football in bad spots. That's kind of the big focus here, in my opinion, for Green Bay. Take care of the football, control the football, minimize the risks, and do your best to try and ground and pound your way to victory. It looks like there might be a weakness as far as defending against the run in Indianapolis. That's probably going to be the path to success. That all being said, I'm curious how quickly that can come to fruition in Green Bay, because it's probably going to be what they have to do the next few weeks is ground and pound football, take care of it, don't put it in bad places. So I'm leaning Indianapolis here in this one, not by a lot, but I do have them winning 24-17. I just have a really hard time with the quarterback situation in Green Bay going with them, even if they are in Green Bay, and with how talented that young wide receiver room is. I don't know if I trust Malik Willis or Sean Clifford, I think, is the other guy as well that you have on the practice squad there who's going to be playing backup, I would assume. So I think I'm going to lean Indianapolis on this one here, simply because I have some concerns as to what that quarterback situation is going to look like, at least coming out of the gate this first week with a new one under center. Next, we have the New York Jets taking on the Tennessee Titans here. First thing I'm looking at is going to be on the Jets side of things, and that is going to be running back Breece Hall, averaging just 3.4 yards per attempt, and he had a game-breaking early fumble on top of that. He has got to take care of the football, and he needs to find some success on the ground here. And that, of course, you look at the offensive line of the New York Jets, and you can say that to them as well. They got to open up those running lanes. Titans allowed only 84 yards, rushing last week against Chicago. So this is one of those things where you're going to come in and you're going to challenge this Titans defense and see just how true it is to be holding teams under 100 yards in a game for the Tennessee Titans. The next thing I'm also looking at here is going to be ball protection on Tennessee's side. Turning the football over is what killed this team. You had 3 turnovers altogether. That's not including the blocked punt that went for 6. One of those turnovers was the pick 6 that ultimately cost you the game against Chicago as well. The Titans, for the first half of the game, looked really good, but the second half, it was just mistake after mistake after mistake after mistake that ultimately led to Chicago coming back and winning that game. If you protect the football, I really feel like this team can be a solid team and compete at least somewhat, but you have got to take care of the football. You are not going to win football games with 3 turnovers and a blocked punt that goes for 6. Jets defensive line also needs to be aggressive here. If the Jets want to come out and win this game via defense, they've got to make Will Levis uncomfortable, because we saw what Chicago did in those instances where they were making him uncomfortable. It led to bad mistakes. It led to turnovers. It led to points from the turnovers. So Jets defensive line, I'm looking at you guys. You got to be aggressive. You got to be able to go after him. They had 2 sacks against San Francisco last week, and in my opinion, I would say San Francisco has a little bit of a better offensive line than what Tennessee's got going on right now. With those 3 sacks last week on Will Levis, I could see some more pressure from the Jets defensive line creating issues. And then the rhythm of the Jets offense as a whole. When you look at the way things started, initial first drive, Allen Lazard, and he had a great game, 2 touchdowns, 89 yards, great game after that. However, that first third down that he drops a wide open reception, that's the type of stuff that you cannot have happening on your opening drive. And again, the Breece Hall thing, literally the next drive after the fact, there were just certain things that were going on in key situations that were really killing this Jets team. Tipped interception would be another one that I could point to as well. San Francisco basically scoring after every single turnover and taking advantage of all of those mistakes. You've got to play clean football on your end as well. Find that rhythm. No concentration drops and things like that. Make sure the ball is in your hands before you're worried about where you're going, things like that. You just got to be smart about it, because this is a Jets team that I do think has a lot more talent and should be a lot better than what we saw from them last week. Maybe it's a little bit of rust with Aaron Rodgers and just him shaking some things off, and just this offense trying to get a feel for itself now with Aaron Rodgers under center. Maybe it's something that'll have some growing pains. You didn't see Aaron Rodgers in the preseason, so there is that. So overall, this is a team that if they can just find their rhythm, I do think has a really good chance at taking it to the Tennessee Titans. And while I am a little bit concerned about a couple of corners in New York questionable right now in DJ Reed and Michael Carter III, I am more concerned about the Titans offense right now than I am the Jets defense. So I am going to lean Jets on this one. I have them taking the W 23-19. Good contest. I think Tennessee is able to hang around a little bit because, again, the offense of the Jets feels like it's knocking some rust off and just kind of figuring itself out with another new quarterback under center. So we'll see where they go from there, but I do think they can get one over the Titans. Next, we have ourselves the San Francisco 49ers taking on the Minnesota Vikings. And I've got to say, the Vikings really shocked me last week. And as I'm watching that Vikings game unfold, I'm thinking to myself, wow, I cannot believe I picked against them with just how bad the New York Giants looked. However, the Vikings are welcoming an extremely difficult challenge into their stadium this week in the San Francisco 49ers, who looked like they were in midseason form despite Christian McCaffrey not even playing. Now, there's a lot going on around that right now. Christian McCaffrey even recently said himself that he is preparing as if he is going to play this Sunday. We'll obviously see if that winds up being the case, but if not, running back Jordan Mason looked awesome. 147 yards, rushing touchdown. I'm very curious to see what happens. I think he carried the ball 28 times in that matchup as well. The 49ers basically acted like they weren't missing Christian McCaffrey, and for the most part, it worked. So I'll be interested to see how things go from here if he's not playing again this week. Nick Bosa and Leonard Floyd, I'm looking at these two guys on the 49ers defense as well. It is up to them to make Sam Darnold as uncomfortable as possible because the Jets really did not do that. Kevin O'Connell did a great job of putting him in good situations and calling the right plays to help Sam Darnold look fantastic in the early going of that matchup. And for the duration of the game, for the most part, barring an interception, it was a great game for Sam Darnold altogether. One of the best, I would argue, he's probably ever had as a pro. Nick Bosa and Leonard Floyd, two sack machines, got to get after him, got to make him uncomfortable, make him see those ghosts again he was seeing when he was in the New York Jets side of things instead of this new successful offense he's found himself in. I'm also obviously going to be closely watching what Sam Darnold does as well because, as I mentioned, I feel like he looked every bit of the part of the first-round talent he was drafted as a handful of years ago. So if this really is just a matter of him going to a situation where he is in a better offense with better talent around him, better coaching staff, obviously he was in a great position last year, but it wasn't his team. He wasn't the starter. I'm excited to honestly see how this unfolds now because I'm not very high on Sam Darnold. I'll be completely honest with the Vikings fans. I've not been high on this move. I did not really expect anything much of it. It looked really good in week one, but you now have a big challenge here. Another thing that I'm watching, which is more just like a player-on-player matchup here, is going to be Jonathan Grenard versus Trent Williams. This is a fun matchup. Grenard had a big season last year, exploded onto the scene, really let everyone know what he was all about. Trent Williams being the best left tackle in the NFL right now. I'm not even going to say arguably, he is that guy, and until he's not that guy, he is that guy on the left side of offensive lines. Very curious to see how he fares against the perennial All-Pro, Pro Bowl, unbelievably talented and very highly and well-paid left tackle. As for the actual game, though, who I think is going to win here, I'm very curious to see how the Vikings handle a team that is as good as the San Francisco 49ers because they looked like nails against the Giants, but I don't think we're going to get the same outcome or production from the Vikings end of things against a San Francisco 49ers team that is hell-bent on trying to get themselves back to a Super Bowl after taking the loss last year for the second time in the last handful of seasons to the Kansas City Chiefs. There are some injuries to watch on both sides here. Center Garrett Bradbury, Andrew Van Ginkel, who had the pick six off Daniel Jones, and Jordan Addison are all questionable. Jordan Addison was able to play last week. I was actually surprised. I thought he may miss week number 1, but he found himself on the football field at times. And then on the 49ers end, of course, Christian McCaffrey's on there, but you also have safety Talanoa Hufanga that's on that list as well. But nothing that's really too game-breaking, I think, for either team. I do really like the 49ers in this matchup, though. I have a very hard time seeing the Vikings pulling off a big win, even if they are at home here. So I'm going to take San Francisco 35-20. I think there's a bit of a reality check coming here for the Vikings. I could be wrong, obviously. I'll probably eat my words for saying this. I told Patriots fans there was no chance their team was going to win last week, and they ultimately won. So if I'm eating a full bowl of my words tomorrow morning, I'll do so without any milk. The next matchup that I'm looking at is going to be the Seattle Seahawks taking on the New England Patriots. And the first thing I'm going to be looking at is Ramondre Stevenson and how he fares against the Seattle Seahawks defense. Seattle gave up only 64 yards to Denver's running backs. I believe Bo Nix carried like 35 or so of the total yards that they had on the ground last week. So Seattle did a really good job of bottling up the backs over there in Denver. Ramondre Stevenson, on the other hand, 4.8 yards per attempt, 120 yards and a touchdown last week. He exploded for the offense and was a big reason why they were ultimately able to come away with that win over Cincinnati. I'm also going to be very interested in how the cornerbacks over in New England take on the wide receiver trio that Seattle's bringing into Gillette Stadium. You have DK Metcalf, Tyler Lockett, Jackson Smith-Njigba going up against Christian Gonzalez, Marcus Jones, and Jonathan Jones. This is going to be one of the more fun matchups to watch, in my opinion, throughout the entirety of the weekend slate of games here. You just have so much talent in both groups, and they both have such great impact on what the other group is going to look like coming out of this game. This is going to be a really fun one to watch. The other one is going to be the defensive lines of both of these teams. They both came out looking pretty strong last week. Seattle, 18 pressures, couple of sacks against Denver, gave a lot of problems for Bo Nix in terms of just him being comfortable in the pocket. On the flip side, Patriots managed only 6 sacks, but they did beat them out with an extra sack, 3 on the day against Cincinnati. Whichever one of these teams can generate more pressure and make the other quarterback more uncomfortable, I think swings a big chance for a win in that direction. Seattle also running for 146 yards total versus Denver. The Patriots, third lowest in the league coming out of week 1 with just 70 yards allowed against Cincinnati. Seattle's work's going to be cut out for them on the ground here. Really curious to see how they manage, because this Patriots defense, I think, shocked a lot of people last week and did some things that no one really anticipated, and it's going to be this one's going to be like one of those more slugfest type of matchups, in my opinion. There are a lot of injuries to keep an eye on both sides here. You have linebacker Tyrell Dodson, Tyreek Woolen, Jerome Baker, and Tyler Lockett all listed as questionable. And on the Patriots side of things, Dietrich Wise, the defensive end, offensive guard Sidney Saud, safety Jabril Peppers, offensive lineman Josh Uche, a few other questionables listed as well. A lot of guys on both these teams' injury reports, but not anything that sounds too scary. Like, you might miss out on one or two of these guys altogether, but it seems like a vast majority of these guys should be able to go come Sunday, but we'll see. As for who I think is going to win, though, I'm leaning Seattle on this one here. I do think that there is a chance the Patriots come out with a win on this one here. I think the defense over there in New England is very much legit. I was kind of worried about how things were going to look without Bill Belichick and how that defense was going to operate, if it was still going to be just as effective. But it seems like the teachings of Bill, at least defensively, have stayed in New England, and they are still a very tough, disciplined, and very good at what they do defense. And I think that this is one of those things where the Patriots, the offense might not be great all season long because it's right now Jacoby Brissett and not a ton of talent on the offensive side of things, but also if Drake May ends up coming in eventually, young rookie quarterback who's going to deal with his growing pains, still with the same skill set of guys. I think that the offense may sputter week in and week out, but this defense is a very strong, well-disciplined unit, and they're going to keep games low scoring, and it's going to keep them in and help them potentially win. But there's going to be those games where rather than getting the win 16-10 against a team like Cincinnati, you wind up maybe letting a touchdown too much and end up losing by a couple of points like I have them here, 22-20. We next have a exciting matchup in the New York Giants taking on the Washington Commanders. This one in Washington, we have ourselves an NFC East divisional clash here. The two worst offensive lines in terms of sacks allowed last year going head-to-head to see who is going to reclaim that throne potentially. Daniel Jones last week looked not very good. We could just put it simply. 4.4 yards per completion, no touchdowns thrown, couple of interceptions. One of those was the pick 6 to Andrew Van Ginkel we were talking about earlier. Washington, though, allowed 286 yards and 4 touchdowns to Baker Mayfield in Tampa Bay, but it is Tampa Bay and Baker Mayfield, so I don't really know if that means much for New York, but that is a positive to at least have in mind coming into the game. The running backs over there in Washington against the defensive front in New York is something I'll be interested in watching as well in this one here, because you have Brian Robinson and Austin Eckler, who are two capable backs in my opinion, very capable at that. Commanders managed only 50 rushing yards, though, from their running backs last week. I believe it was the more than almost a third, honestly, or almost 2/3, excuse me, of their rushing came from Jaden Daniels running himself. But the Giants did allow about 94 yards to Minnesota's Aaron Jones, so there is maybe a shot that they find some more success on the ground as well. The other thing I'll be keeping an eye on here is the offensive lines specifically. Both of these teams, the defensive fronts, because both of these teams managed only 1 sack last week against their week 1 opponents. Now, I'm very curious to see who brings more pressure and which offensive line between these two teams falters the most, because I do think that is something that winds up being the catalyst for who wins this football game and who loses this football game. Again, these were the 2 worst offensive lines in terms of pass protection last year. I believe the Giants finished the year with 85 sacks allowed, and the Commanders were behind them by a pretty large margin at 65. And right now, it does not seem like the Giants' offensive line has gotten much better. I'm pretty sure Daniel Jones was sacked 5 times. I forgot to put it in my notes here, but I'm pretty sure it was 5 times last week. We saw, I believe, 2 sacks on Jaden Daniels. Might have been 3, but I think it was 2. This is one of those games where whatever offensive line holds up more, I think that winning team or that team winds up winning the football game here, because you have a rookie quarterback in Jaden Daniels. It's a new head coach situation there with Dan Quinn and everyone just kind of getting their feet underneath themselves these first few weeks of the season. But on the other side, you have Daniel Jones and not a whole lot besides Malik Neighbors. So I think I'm leaning Commanders in this matchup here. I have them winning 23-19, but keep an eye on the offensive lines. Whoever could protect their quarterback best, I think winds up winning this football game. We next have ourselves the Los Angeles Chargers going into Carolina to take on the Panthers. I really don't have a ton to say about this. My biggest takeaway of the Carolina Panthers is that, and it sucks because ownership just changed in Carolina not too long ago, but somehow it feels like the Panthers are worse off for it. And I can't believe that that's the situation that the Panthers are currently in right now. This team does not have the talent, and it's too early to say coaching, but at least does not have the talent to be able to win more than like 2 or 3 football games in a season. And it's really awful. You have the Panthers D-line that's going to be dealing with J.K. Dobbins and Gus Edwards this week. The Chargers combined for 161 yards against Las Vegas, and they have a pretty good defensive front. Like, you're talking Max Crosby, you're talking Christian Wilkins, just at the very front level of that defense. Carolina allowed 180 yards last week to New Orleans. I'm going to assume that the Chargers, with Jim Harbaugh and his love of running the football, is going to see that and probably want to top the number. He's probably challenging his team to rush for 200 yards. If I have an understanding of the type of coach that Jim Harbaugh is, he probably wants 200 yards after watching the Saints hit 180. You couple that with the Panthers O-line being in shambles. You had 2.5 sacks between just Joey Bosa and Khalil Mack alone. I know Joey Bosa is listed as questionable right now, but I'm assuming he's going to play. But Bryce Young was sacked 4 times last week. Khalil Mack had 17.5 sacks last year. Joey Bosa is playing. I know he's dealing with something. There's probably a chance he misses this football game, but even if he does, Khalil Mack is still a terror in his own right on his own. And you also look at the injury report of the Panthers, and you have guards Damian Lewis and Robert Hunt both on there right now. I am very worried about this Panthers team. I do not know where they go this season, but it's definitely not up. If they win this game, I might have to eat a sock or something, but I'm going Chargers. I have them winning 35-16. I would not be shocked if Jim Harbaugh is running this football down their throat, because there's no way with his idea of we're going to run the ball and seeing what New Orleans did last week and what they were able to accomplish themselves last week, he's not looking at Carolina going, guys, we're shooting for 200 yards rushing. Sorry, Justin Herbert. We know that you're getting paid all the money to be that guy, but we're getting 200 yards against this team on the ground. I would not be shocked if that's the message. I'll take the Chargers, though, 35-16. I think it's going to be ugly. I think that the Panthers, unfortunately, are in for some ugly games this year. We next have ourselves the Cleveland Browns going into Jacksonville to take on the Jaguars. And I will say, first and foremost, I am definitely worried about what this Browns team might end up being this year. Defense did not look great. The offense was not putting them in great situations either. It was overall just a really tough day against the Dallas Cowboys last week, and I don't really know what this team winds up looking like going forward. Deshaun Watson just looked extremely uncomfortable during that game. He had a couple of interceptions and just some really bad throws. But for what it's worth, the Jaguars weren't perfect themselves, and I do think that this game is probably more winnable than whatever last week was against the Dallas Cowboys. First thing I'll be looking at is the Jaguars wide receivers against the Browns cornerbacks. You have Brian Thomas Jr., Gabe Davis, and Christian Kirk, who all totaled up 8 receptions, a touchdown, and 139 yards between just those 3 alone. You got a pretty good group of corners over there in Cleveland with Denzel Ward, Greg Newsome, and Martin Emerson Jr. as well. So it'll be a fun group to watch go back and forth between those two. You also have Trayvon Walker and Josh Hines Allen, excuse me. I'm still messing that up, but I'm trying my best to get that right. Sorry, Josh Hines Allen. Trayvon Walker had 2 sacks against Miami last week, and there is some serious uncertainty right now regarding the health of the O-line of the Cleveland Browns, as both Jedrick Wills and Jack Conklin are still questionable, and it's unsure if they're going to play. But now you have guard Joel Bitonio also on there as well. If you're still missing your 2 tackles, that is not where you want to be. You had 5 sacks allowed against Dallas last week, and I think that Trayvon Walker and Josh Hines Allen could do some damage if you don't have either one of those 2 guys playing. And if Joel Bitonio misses the game, forget about it. You already lost David Njoku, which is awful for your offense. He was an absolute stud last year. He's out. There's a lot of things that I'm concerned about with Cleveland right now, and the only thing that I can really look at where I go, Cleveland will have a shot, is if, they can take care of the football more, run maybe the football a little bit more, take it out of Deshaun Watson's hands just so he doesn't feel so much pressure, and, hope that maybe your defensive front over there in Cleveland, which is an impressive group of guys. You obviously have Myles Garrett, Preston Smith, but Trevor Lawrence was sacked 3 times last week against Miami, and I would assume that your group is probably better than what Miami had, so maybe there's a weakness on that O-line that they can exploit, make Trevor Lawrence uncomfortable, force him into some bad throws, so there is that to keep in mind. And they did have 3 sacks against Dak Prescott last week, so there's a chance that maybe if Cleveland generates enough pressure, disrupts what they're trying to do in the passing game, that maybe they have a shot. But Jacksonville did look solid on the ground as well. So there's a lot to look at in this one here. I have a tight contest. I don't really think it's a runaway by either side. I think this one winds up being close because neither of these teams neither of these teams were perfect by any means. They were both very far from that in their losses here. Jaguars kind of choking the game away late with some of the mistakes they were making. And then, of course, the Browns just never really had a chance last week against the Cowboys. But I'll take Jacksonville. I have them winning 20-17. I think it's going to be a fun contest, but definitely one that is going to be close in my opinion. Unless the Browns are in a really bad spot, then, maybe they run away with it. But we'll see. Next, we're looking at the Raiders as they head into Baltimore to take on the Ravens. I will say that I was very concerned about Gardner Minshew being quarterback, and he did a good job of alleviating some of those concerns. He had a really good game, over 250 yards, touchdown, interception. Definitely bigger numbers than I would have expected out of week 1 from him, especially when you see what some of the other, I would argue, better quarterbacks did in their week 1 matchups and how much they were able to put up. But the offense, if it's going to be one-dimensional and they're not going to be able to run the football, that is going to lead to some problems. They managed only 71 yards rushing against the Chargers, and Baltimore has been a fantastic run defense now for the last few years. They allowed only 72 yards against Kansas City. It is going to be a problem if they are just going to try to pass against the Baltimore Ravens. Now, there are some pass protection issues that I have concerns with. Minshew was sacked 4 times last week, and Baltimore, they managed only 7 pressures and a couple of sacks, but you now have 3 offensive linemen that are currently listed as questionable, with Andre James, your center, offensive tackle Colton Miller, and guard Jackson Powers Johnson. So if all of those guys either miss the game or maybe even 1 or 2 of them are missing, you have concerns about how the O-line's going to hold up. You're going up against a pretty good defense and a team that I believe finished first or second in sacks last year. I can't remember if it was them or the Chiefs, but they were up there. This is a good group here. The one thing that I can look at, though, positively for the offense of the Raiders, though, I will say that there are some new defensive coordinator, well, not new defensive coordinator, but defensive coordinator change in Baltimore obviously ultimately leads to Mike Macdonald leaving, and now Zach Orr takes things over. There's going to be growing pains with that. It was never going to be perfect one-to-one, and we saw some of the miscommunication and just like issues that this Baltimore Ravens defense is going to deal with as they get used to having Zach Orr calling games his way and how they're going to have to handle certain situations under him rather than Mike Macdonald, who clearly proved his worth last year, now landing a head coaching gig as the Seattle Seahawks head coach. When you look at something kind of like the Marlon Humphrey situation where he let, because apparently it seems like he assumed that there was safety help over the top, but there obviously was not, letting Xavier Worthy essentially run free for a touchdown reception. Minshew managed 250 yards last week against the Chargers. If they're still dealing with some of that stuff in Baltimore, Mahomes managed and I know it's Mahomes, but he still had 291 yards against the Ravens defense. There is a chance that maybe you find some good success throwing the football. You also have talented wide receivers there in Las Vegas. So if Gardner Minshew's not throwing the game away, not making boneheaded mistakes, you're good. And he's not really one to do those kinds of things. Like Gardner Minshew's a guy that I look at as he's not going to lose you a game, and he might not win you games, but he'll have you competitive in games, and that's a good thing. On top of that, for Baltimore's side of things, because I feel like I've spent a lot of conversation right now on the Raiders, but one thing about Baltimore, I'm expecting them to want to run the football a lot in this one here. That is their bread and butter ultimately, and they're catching a lot of flack for not utilizing Derrick Henry more than they did. I expect to see them run the football a little bit more heavily. Los Angeles totaled 176 yards on the ground against the Raiders last week. Whether that was just, mistakes on the Raiders' end, or if maybe there is actually a weakness within the Raiders' defense that, we're just not understanding against the run right now, there's a good chance that maybe we see Baltimore really challenge them on the ground and see if that is the actual case. And with running the football being the bread and butter of the Baltimore Ravens, you also have Lamar Jackson, who can kill you on the ground. You saw what he did last week against the Kansas City Chiefs. Don't be surprised if we see a lot of running from the Baltimore Ravens here. As for who I think comes out victorious, though, I do think I like the Baltimore Ravens, and I kind of like them a lot in this one here. I'm really curious to see, with the struggles that they had against the Chargers, how they're going to fare against the Ravens team that I would consider much better. And I'm a little bit worried about the Raiders in this one here. I thought they were going to get the job done last week against the Los Angeles Chargers, but either I was way off or there was just a lot of mistakes being made on the Raiders' end. But I think Baltimore comes into this matchup. They're at home opener, off of losing a game by a toe, literally. I think the Ravens come in, and you might catch the brunt end of some angry feelings that the Baltimore Ravens might be feeling. So I have them winning 28-14. Next, we have ourselves the Rams heading into Arizona to take on the Cardinals. I was interested in what the betting odds were going to be for this, like who the favorites were as far as the spread goes. I don't bet or anything, but I am always curious as to like who's favored and whatnot. And I was surprised to see that the Cardinals are still favored. I know you get 3 points for being the home team, and then it kind of swings from there. But I was surprised to see that the Cardinals are still favorites despite kind of where they are. But they did take it to Buffalo. Baltimore still in the mind. They did take it to Buffalo last week. Close game. But on top of that, there is a good reason why they're probably still favorites, and it's because of the injury report. You look at the offensive line right now and just the amount of injuries that the Rams came out of week 1 with, and there is some reason for concern. Guard Steve Avila and tackle Joseph Noteboom both got sent to the IR, along with Puka Nacua. You also have questionable Rob Havenstein and your guard Kevin Dotson as well. Those are 4 starting offensive linemen. 2 of them are guaranteed not to play. Good chance that maybe 1 or 2 of them also do not play in this matchup as well. I'm really concerned about what this Rams offense will be able to do behind what is like basically a group of backup offensive linemen, a makeshift group at best that you're just going to have to kind of throw together and hope works out. Besides that, I do still think that the Rams are the better team in this matchup. It's just a matter of, again, health on the O-line and them being able to deal with the other injuries that they have. Because I still look at Arizona's defense as one of the worst in the league right now, one of the least talented that we have. And then on top of that, the offense started out hot, but then kind of died out. And if it wasn't for a return in the kickoff, by the Cardinals. The game against the Bills is even further apart than the scoreboard actually looks. Marvin Harrison Jr. only had 3 targets, a single reception for 4 yards. The Rams really didn't allow a ton against the wide receivers of Detroit last week. 8 catches, 134 yards, and one of those was just one really big 52-yard play. You take that out, and the number's under 100 yards on 7 total receptions there. Marvin Harrison needs to be seeing the football more, at least 6 to 7 targets per game. I don't really know how you get away with just 3 targets to the guy that you take number 4 overall to be your legit wide receiver 1 because you don't have one. He needs to see the football more. And on top of that, you now come into this matchup here for the Rams, and a concern that I also have, because they traded away Ernest Jones a couple weeks ago, linebacker Christian Rosewoom's also questionable. I'm now wondering who's going to play that spy role against Kyler Murray, because he was torching Buffalo on the ground early on. It got, Buffalo tightened up and they took care of what they needed to take care of late in the game. But you're looking at either Troy Reeder or Cameron Curl if Christian Rosewoom's not able to play. Who's going to be the guy that spies for Kyler Murray, and how is this defense going to be able to slow them down? This is one of those games that I think could wind up seeing some points, but I do have more trust in the Rams. But if I'm wrong on this one, I won't be surprised. There is so much going on offensively in terms of injuries for the Rams that I'm kind of scared to pick them to win here. But I am going to take them, and I'm going to take them 22-21. This is one that if I'm wrong, I'm not surprised. I am very 50-50 on who comes out victorious in this one here because of the amount of injuries that the Rams came out of week 1 with. They just have, and when the offensive lines are battered like this, things get really ugly. I'll take the Rams, though, because I do still think they're the more talented team. I do think that the defense will be able to give the Arizona Cardinals some fits, but man, oh man, am I worried about the Rams right now. Next, we are looking at the Pittsburgh Steelers heading into Denver to take on the Broncos. And from the research I have done, it appears that Mike Tomlin has a record of 24-6 against rookie quarterbacks. I was finding some weird conflicting information on that because I saw something about it earlier yesterday. And then when I was doing the research, there were places saying 25-5, and then there were places saying 24-6. But I found more places than not saying 24-6. So if that number's wrong, feel free to correct me. But I was looking at a bunch of different places and kept getting 2 different records. But it looks like Tomlin, at a record of 24-6, has no problem giving rookie quarterbacks an awful 60 minutes of play. With some of the best defenses you see year in and year out, coupled with the very exotic looks that they love to run, all the crazy blitzes, it's no surprise. But now Bo Nix has his hands full. Pittsburgh struggled to get in the end zone last week. That'll be something worth watching in this matchup here, going 0-for-2 in the red zone on top of that. Denver did show that they could create some problems defensively last week. They had 10 pressures, 2 sacks. They racked up a couple of safeties. Some great job on special teams pinning the Seattle Seahawks back early and making that game a lot more uncomfortable than I think Seattle was hoping it would be. But the big thing that I'm worried about in this one here is going to be the Denver Broncos offensive line. They are going to need to play their best 60 minutes of football this week if they want to come out victorious. Pittsburgh finished with only 2 sacks, but it felt like they had things constantly being wiped away via penalties for TJ Watt, and it feels like he had 2 sacks stolen from him in that game, so that number could be higher had it not been for some unfortunate penalties. Pittsburgh also generated pressure on nearly 40% of Atlanta's dropbacks. That is going to be a lot to deal with for a rookie quarterback who has not seen this type of pressure to this point here. Seattle was good. They gave them some problems, but I would say that the pass rush that they have over there in Pittsburgh is going to be quite the welcome to the NFL group that Bo Nix does not want to run into. As for who I think is going to win this matchup here, I'm very curious to see if Russell Wilson ends up playing. It sounds like, though, that they're feeling like it's still Justin Fields and he's going to be the guy to go. If it is, we'll see how that works itself out. A lot more on the ground, I guess, and maybe some passes over the middle of the field. If you didn't see Justin Fields' pass chart, that was the craziest thing I've ever seen. There was nothing inside the hash marks. But I do like the Steelers in this one here. I think this is going to be a tough one offensively for Denver with just how good that defense is over there. You saw what the Steelers did to the Falcons last week. It was not pretty. I have the Steelers winning 20-9. I think we're still going to see some offensive woes on Pittsburgh's end, but they should have enough in terms of just stops, maybe some forced turnovers and some good field position to get some points on the board, and hopefully their first touchdown of the season here in week 2. Next, We're looking at the Cincinnati Bengals and the Kansas City Chiefs. This one in Kansas City. Patrick Mahomes takes on Joe Burrow. Big thing that I'm watching in this one here is going to be the Chiefs' defensive line versus the Bengals' offensive line. Cincinnati allowed 3 sacks against New England, but only 6 pressures, but those 3 sacks were tough, and Joe Burrow probably felt like he was seeing more than just 6 pressures in that game, and he even kind of said that himself, that he was a little bit jumpy in the pocket here. KC managed 12 pressures, only 1 sack. Chris Jones being the guy that had that 1 sack here. I'll be very curious to see how things look for Kansas City this week because they had a really tough time generating pressure against the Ravens. I know that it says 12 pressures, but it was not in the key situations it needed to be is the best way I can put that. When it got to late in the game, it felt like they were doing a lot of 4-man rushes, and they were not really doing much to make Lamar Jackson uncomfortable. And Lamar Jackson, he's a guy that'll get out of the pocket and bail out, so no big deal. Joe Burrow, though, he's not Lamar Jackson. I'm curious if the pressure gets going and he's already feeling shaky, just what this game might actually end up looking like. Hopefully he's feeling a little bit better, a little bit more comfortable going into this matchup here, but that was definitely a bit of an eye-opening affair against the Patriots. Bengals also have a new running back in Zach Moss. KC allowed only 49 yards to Baltimore's running backs. They were killed on the ground by Lamar Jackson. He had like 120-something yards, but 49 yards to only the running backs here. Zach Moss didn't get a ton of opportunities last week, but he's someone that I think deserves to see more, especially if Joe Burrow's having a hard time. I do think Zach Moss, talented back, earned himself a starting spot last week in place of Jonathan Taylor on the Colts last year. He had 49 yards on 9 carries, averaging 4.9 yards per attempt. This is a guy that I would love to see get the football more. So let's hand the ball off to Zach Moss, ground and pound if you need to. If Joe Burrow's really having a hard time getting into rhythm, you got a really good defense that you're going up against. You'll have a good challenge in trying to do so because I do think that the Chiefs have one of the better linebacking rooms in the NFL with Nick Bolton, Leo Chenal, and Drew Tranquill, but I would love to see them run the football. And then one matchup specifically that I'm really looking forward to seeing because Jamar Chase didn't look great last week is how he looks going up against Trent McDuffie this week. Trent McDuffie, All-Pro last year. He had 4 receptions allowed last week on 7 targets, but it was only for 40 yards. So 10 yards a catch wasn't anything too detrimental. Chase clearly frustrated with what he got last week, saw only 6 targets, 6 receptions, 62 yards. He's hoping to see some more. You're also wondering, as far as injuries go, is T. Higgins going to play? How's offensive tackle Amarius Mims looking like for the Bengals? There are some things that have me a little bit concerned about Cincinnati. I like the Chiefs in this matchup here. I'm going to take them for the win. I have them winning 23-20. Bengals do a good job of playing the Chiefs close, so I won't be shocked if it's a tight game here, but I do like the Chiefs. We next have the Chicago Bears going into Houston to take on the Houston Texans. We have last year's, what should have been number 1 overall pick, but was not, going up against this year's number 1 overall pick. CJ Stroud leading the Texans got himself a really good challenge in the Chicago secondary this week. Stroud racked up 234 yards and a couple of touchdowns against Indianapolis last week. Chicago, though, their defense gave Will, after they settled in, because it took them a little bit of settling in, like the Titans were giving them some problems early. Once they settled in, gave Will Levis problems the back half of the football game, third quarter on, ending with 2 interceptions, one of them being a pick 6. This will be a tough test for CJ Stroud. You couple that with the fact that Chicago has a good shot at disrupting the pass for Houston. Stroud was sacked 4 times last week. Chicago tied for second in pressures last week with 18 plus the 3 sacks they got. Definitely something worth keeping an eye on here. On Caleb Williams' end, Houston has a weird stat line against the pass coming out of last week because they allowed a ton of yards, but they only allowed 9 completions, which is like the weird thing. So 212 yards and a couple of touchdowns allowed, but they had an interception and allowed only 9 completions. So if they can just cover up over top, I think they'll be fine. I'm rooting for Caleb Williams to have a better performance, and I do think that there's a chance that they do, because there was clearly mistakes being made by the Texans defense that we'll see if they correct here coming into this next week that I think you could take advantage of. But it really is going to come down to just Chicago's ability to take care of Caleb Williams, keep him protected inside the pocket, and help him feel comfortable. That is probably the biggest thing you're going to need. It was clear that all the rookie quarterbacks were a little bit shell-shocked by just how crazy things can be in the NFL. Caleb Williams was obviously no exception to that. If they can just take care of him, find ways to convert on third down, and hopefully the pressure isn't too crazy coming in from the middle of that offensive line because it was not great, allowing as much as they did, I do think they have themselves a good shot at being competitive in this matchup. But as far as winning is concerned, I don't know. I could see the Bears defense giving Houston some fits and keeping the score lower, but I'm going to need to see some actual offense from the Bears before I can go ahead and pick them for another win. They definitely scared me last week, so I'll take the Texans 20-17. Should be a fun contest, but would I be shocked if Houston ends up running away from this game? Absolutely not, because that was that was typical Bears and I've spoke to a handful of Bears fans this past week about this where I work. It was a typical Bears football game. No offense, a lot of defense, got themselves a win. The next matchup that I'm going to be looking at here is the Atlanta Falcons taking on the Philadelphia Eagles. Real concern brewing right now in Atlanta in regards to just how healthy Kirk Cousins actually is. That Achilles injury did happen late enough into the season last year that I think it's fair to wonder just where exactly is he in this recovery process, and taking 96% of his snaps out of the shotgun and or pistol with a noticeable adjustment to his pre-snap stance as well. There's definitely something going on, and I'm curious if this ends up affecting what this offense looks like in the short term or even in the long term. Like, is this going to have to be what the offense is for the rest of the year? Is that going to cause problems? Do we end up seeing Michael Penix Jr. earlier than we thought because of this? Like, there is a lot of question marks surrounding Atlanta right now. Cousins struggled under pressure. He threw a couple of interceptions. He only had 155 yards. Philadelphia, granted, did allow it, 260 against Jordan Love, so there is that positive to keep in mind. Maybe we see some improvement from the passing game. There were some moments where things look good. Kyle Pitts catching a touchdown. That's always nice to see in week number 1, considering it felt like the Falcons were allergic to throwing to him in the end zone for the first handful of years of his career. But there is definitely some concern to be had there. And then you have a Philadelphia Eagles team who can clearly throw the football. They bring in Saquon Barkley. He had 109 yards and a couple of touchdowns on the ground. Atlanta allowed only 93 yards against Pittsburgh, but this is Saquon Barkley, and Saquon Barkley has never been in an offense this talented where he's not the focal point, and he has a good chance of being a real problem, and I could see it happening in this matchup here as well. You couple that with the fact that Philadelphia has one of the best run-blocking O-lines in the NFL, and I don't really think that's a question. This could be a bit of an issue for Atlanta if they can't keep up. I'm also going to be very interested in seeing how Eagles linebacker Zach Bond does in this game here. He was someone that I felt like I was seeing all over the field, and then when I looked at his stat sheet at the end of the game, 15 tackles, a tackle for loss, 2 sacks, and 3 pressures. He was everywhere for that defense. So big ups to him. Definitely keeping an eye on him and seeing how he handles the middle of the football field here. And then Atlanta's pass rush is also something that I'm kind of looking at. There should be an improvement over the long term of this season with this pass rush here, but you finished last week with only 8 pressures and a couple of sacks against a Pittsburgh team that's starting 2 rookies on their offensive line. You would like to see more after making that move for Matt Judon, and I can't even imagine, had this team not brought him in, what this pass rush could have actually looked like, because Judon's going to be a good plus for this team, but even with his addition, finishing, again, 8 pressures, 2 sacks against an O-line with 2 rookies that are starting on there, you're hoping to see more than just that. So we'll see what happens with Atlanta in the long term, but I'm definitely a little bit worried about them because the defense looked good, held Pittsburgh obviously to 6 field goals. Great job on that part there, but they were not as aggressive and as overwhelming as I thought they might end up being with some of the additions that they've made here. I'm more concerned though about the offense than anything else. The Atlanta Falcons defense is the least of their worries right now, but I am genuinely concerned about what's going on with Kirk Cousins right now, and a lot of people have been talking about it. And there's definitely something going on there. I don't think it was just by chance that they ran 96% of their offense not under center. So we'll see how that progresses over the next few weeks. But one definitely has to wonder where Kirk Cousins stands right now health-wise. As for who I think is going to win, be it that Philadelphia is at home and there is some uncertainty surrounding the Atlanta Falcons offense right now, I think we get maybe a little bit of a better performance because, again, there is some concern about this passing defense still in Philadelphia. They struggled. They got a lot of new young faces working there. Quinion Mitchell looked good, but he did have some rookie mistakes as well. I think Philadelphia finds success. They should have a good, potent offense in this matchup here. I like them winning 28-20 as the Falcons continue to try to sort themselves out offensively. But I do like the Eagles in this one for the W to wrap up week number 2. But those are my picks for week 2 of the NFL. Comment down below. Let me hear your thoughts, your opinions, your picks. Who do you like? Who do you not like? fire away. Would love to discuss. But that is it for me, as always. If you made it to the end, I greatly appreciate it. See you all next time. Have a good one.